Napoleon Bonaparte shattered Prussia in 33 days. He destroyed the Austrian army at Austerlitz before winter had properly set in. He marched into the capitals of the oldest dynasties in Europe and dictated terms to emperors who had ruled for centuries. At his peak, no general alive could read a battlefield the way he could, move an army the way he could, or bend the chaos of war into something that looked, from a distance, almost like mathematics. And then, one by one, they stopped him. Not through luck, not through the Russian winter or a single catastrophic blunder. The armies that had broken and fled before him began to hold. Then they began to push back. Then they hunted him across Europe, tore his empire apart, and put him on a ship to an island in the South Atlantic. The greatest military mind of the modern age was beaten, systematically, repeatedly, and in the end, completely. The real question was never how he won. The real question was what it took for the rest of the world to make him stop. The armies of 18th century Europe moved like furniture. A force of 80,000 men required a supply chain that stretched back hundreds of miles. Wagons of flour, barrels of salt meat, fodder for the horses, depots positioned at careful intervals across the road network. A general who outran his supply line did not have an army. He had a mob. Speed was not a virtue in this system. Speed was recklessness. The men who filled those armies reflected the societies that built them. Officers were aristocrats, commissioned by birth or purchase, their authority resting on rank rather than competence. The rank and file were the poorest men in Europe, conscripted, press-ganged, or driven to enlist by hunger. They were held together not by any shared cause, but by iron discipline, the threat of the lash, and the near impossibility of desertion in a system where every soldier was watched and counted. Battles in this world followed a logic of their own. Two armies maneuvered for position across days or weeks, each commander probing for the moment when terrain and numbers aligned in his favor. When engagement finally came, the lines exchanged volleys at close range until one side's nerve broke. The casualties were often manageable, the objectives limited. War was expensive. It was not supposed to consume entire states. Into this world came the French revolutionary armies of the 1790s, and they operated on different principles entirely. They were larger than anything Europe had fielded in living memory. Conscript armies drawing on the entire male population of France rather than the narrow sliver of men desperate enough to enlist voluntarily. They could absorb losses that would have ended a dynastic army. And because they were too large to feed from depots, they learned, out of necessity, to feed themselves from the land. Living off the country changed everything. An army that carried 3 days' bread and foraged the rest could move at speeds that a depot-dependent force could not match. The French crossed mountains that professional soldiers assumed were impassable in campaign season. They covered distances in a week that Austrian or Prussian staffs scheduled for a month. Their enemies kept waiting for them to slow down. They did not slow down. What Napoleon inherited and then perfected was a system built on this new reality. The central innovation was the Army Corps, a self-contained formation of all arms, typically between 15 and 30,000 men, capable of operating independently for days at a time. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. It could march, fight, forage, and survive without the rest of the army. It was, in effect, a small army inside a larger one. The corps system changed the mathematics of campaign planning in ways that took a generation for Napoleon's enemies to fully absorb. A traditional army had to move as a single mass. The pace of the slowest column set the pace of the entire force. Napoleon's corps moved on separate roads, spread across a front of sometimes 50 or 60 miles. They converged only when battle was imminent. Yet this meant that the army moved faster than any of its parts, and that it arrived at the battlefield from multiple directions simultaneously. Speed and dispersion were the first two elements. The third was the initiative granted to corps commanders. In a traditional army, subordinates executed orders. They did not make decisions. The commander-in-chief controlled everything, and everything waited for his instruction. Napoleon's system demanded something different. Marshals who could read a situation, seize an opportunity, and act without waiting for confirmation. Davout at Austerlitz would hold his ground against odds of 3-1 and win. That kind of judgment could not be ordered from a distance. Napoleon himself sat at the center of a staff system unlike anything his enemies possessed. The Bureau of the Chief of Staff under Berthier functioned as a precision instrument for translating Napoleon's intentions into marching orders for a dozen separate corps operating across hundreds of miles. Orders went out within hours of a decision. Reports came back with comparable speed. The army operated at a tempo that overwhelmed opponents still running on the slower rhythms of 18th century command. Artillery was the fourth element, and Napoleon used it in ways that broke every convention of the time. He concentrated guns, massed them at the decisive point rather than distributing them evenly along the line. A grand battery of 60 or 80 cannon could obliterate a section of the enemy line in less than an hour, punching a hole through which the infantry would then advance. His enemies had the same guns, but they did not use them the same way. The psychological dimension of the system was as important as the mechanical one. Napoleon understood that an army's will to fight was a resource and that it could be destroyed faster than its body. The maneuver sur les derrières, the march around an enemy's flank to cut his line of supply and retreat, worked not primarily because it blocked roads, but because it created panic. A general who discovered that the enemy was behind him as well as in front of him often stopped thinking clearly. Some did not fight at all. In 1805, the Austrian general Mack commanded 60,000 men at Ulm, on the Danube. He had positioned them to defend against a French advance from the west. Napoleon came from the north, crossed the Rhine at half a dozen points simultaneously, swept east and then south in a great arc. Napoleon placed his army between Mack and Vienna before the Austrians understood what was happening. Mack surrendered without a major battle. More than 50,000 men lost across 3 weeks of maneuver because a general had looked in the wrong direction. What happened at Ulm was not a fluke. It was a demonstration of a system operating precisely as designed. Napoleon had not simply outfought his enemy. He had moved faster, coordinated better, decided more quickly, and forced Mack into a position where fighting was pointless. The Austrian army had been destroyed before a single significant engagement. The rest of Europe watched. Most of them did not yet understand what they were watching. The autumn of 1805 opened on a Europe that had not yet processed what France had become. And Austria was the eldest military power on the continent, a dynasty that had been fighting wars since before France was a kingdom, whose officer corps traced its traditions back to the 30 Years' War. When Vienna declared against Napoleon in August 1805, it did so with the confidence of an institution that had survived everything history had thrown at it. That confidence was about to be tested in ways its generals had no category for. The plan Austria and her allies had assembled was not stupid. 3 armies would converge on France from different directions. The main Austrian force under Mack would advance into Bavaria. A Russian army under Kutuzov was marching west to reinforce him, and a third force would press from the north. On paper, the numbers favored the coalition, and Austria and Russia together could field more men than Napoleon. The plan assumed they had time to assemble them. Napoleon gave them no time. He had already moved. While Austrian diplomats were still drafting ultimatums, the Grande Armée, 200,000 men encamped along the Channel coast, the finest force France had ever put in the field, was breaking camp and heading east. It crossed the Rhine on September 25th, a week ahead of any Austrian estimate. The campaign had begun before the enemy knew it was starting. Mack's army at Ulm was watching the passes to the south and west. It was watching the wrong direction. Napoleon sent his corps northeast around the Austrian flank in a sweeping arc that covered more than 200 miles in less than 3 weeks. Ney's corps crossed the Danube at Günzburg. The assaults and lances swung further east. By mid-October, 6 French corps had curved behind the Austrian position like a closing hand, cutting every road between Mack and Vienna. Inside Ulm, Mack could hear the French moving on all sides but could not determine where the main body was. He sent cavalry probes east. They were driven back. He attempted a breakout to the north. It failed. He summoned his officers and told them the situation. Some wept. On October 20th, he walked out of the city gates and surrendered his sword to Napoleon in person. 33,000 men marched into captivity behind him. 20,000 more had been captured or killed in the preceding engagements. The Austrian army in Bavaria had ceased to exist. Kutuzov's Russian army, still marching west, learned what had happened and immediately reversed course. He had no intention of engaging Napoleon alone. He retreated east with skill and discipline, burning bridges behind him, fighting sharp rearguard actions to keep distance between his force and the pursuing French. He was buying time for the Russian Emperor Alexander and the Austrian Emperor Francis to assemble a new combined army. By late November, that army was gathering near Brunn in Moravia, and it numbered around 85,000 men. Napoleon had 80,000, perhaps fewer when the campaign began, and his supply lines stretched back 500 miles to the Rhine. He needed a battle. More precisely, he needed a decisive battle, one that would end the campaign before winter closed in and before the coalition could gather even more strength. He studied the ground around the village of Austerlitz and understood immediately what it offered him. The Pratzen Heights at the center of the battlefield were the key to everything. The trap he set was one of the most elegant in the history of warfare. He deliberately weakened his right flank, pulled troops away from it, made it look unprotected, even ceded ground when Allied probes tested it. He wanted the coalition commanders to see an opportunity there and to reach for it. He wanted them to strip troops from the Pratzen Heights to reinforce the attack on his exposed right. He wanted the heights left thin. Alexander and his Austrian advisors saw exactly what Napoleon intended them to see. The Allied battle plan, drafted largely by the Austrian General Weyrother in a meeting that lasted until 3 a.m, called for a massive flanking attack on the French right, the very move Napoleon had baited them toward. Kutuzov sat through the briefing in silence. According to those present, he appeared to be asleep. He was not a man given to false optimism. December 2nd, 1805. Fog lay across the valley before dawn. The Allied columns began their march south toward the French right, exactly as planned. Then the fog burned off. Napoleon turned to his marshals and said the battle would be won before 1 o'clock. Soult's corps, 40,000 men held in reserve precisely for this moment, drove straight up the Pratzen Heights into the gap the Allies had just created. They reached the crest in 20 minutes. The Allied army was cut in two. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a pursuit. The Allied left, trying to continue its flanking march while the center collapsed above it, found itself trapped between the French right, the French center now dominating the heights, and a frozen lake to the south. Napoleon ordered artillery to fire on the ice. Some accounts of men drowning in the freezing water are probably exaggerated. The lake was shallow, but the panic was real. By mid-afternoon, around 27,000 Allied soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Napoleon had lost fewer than 9,000. The Emperor Francis asked for an armistice the following day. He met Napoleon in a burnt-out mill near the battlefield, still smelling of powder smoke. The Treaty of Pressburg that followed stripped Austria of Venetia, Tyrol, and its remaining influence in Germany. It was the most punishing peace Austria had accepted in a century. Again, the Third Coalition was finished. What Austerlitz left behind, beyond the dead and the territorial adjustments, was a problem that every general in Europe now had to solve. Napoleon had shown in a single campaign how his system worked from start to finish. The speed of assembly, the envelopment at Ulm, the deliberate provocation and catastrophic counterpunch at Austerlitz. The blueprint was now public. The question was whether anyone was capable of reading it. Prussia in 1806 was a state living on borrowed prestige. Its army traced its mythology to Frederick the Great, who had died 23 years earlier, and in those 23 years almost nothing had changed. The same drill manuals, the same formations, the same officer corps, now older and more rigid. Many of the men who had served under Frederick himself and understood his methods as eternal truths rather than solutions to the specific problems of his era. Prussia had not fought a major war since 1763. It believed this was because its army was so formidable that enemies thought twice. It was about to discover the real reason. The Prussian High Command spent the summer of 1806 arguing about whether to fight at all. Moderates counseled negotiation. Hawks insisted the army was more than capable. Queen Louise, one of the most forceful personalities at court, pressed for war. By August, the decision was made. Prussia would join the coalition against France, and it would do so in time to strike before Napoleon could concentrate fully against it. The mobilization orders went out. The army assembled with its customary Frederican precision. It took 6 weeks. Napoleon moved in 6 days. He had anticipated Prussian intervention and had kept the Grande Armée in southern Germany already supplied and positioned. When the declaration of war came, his corps were already marching. He drove them north through the Thuringian forest in 3 parallel columns, a battalion carré formation, each corps close enough to support the others, the whole force feeling its way forward like a fist. By the time the Prussian High Command had finished debating their operational plan, the French were already past their southern flank. The Prussian army moved to meet the threat near the town of Jena on October 14th. What its commanders did not know was that they were not facing Napoleon's main body. They were facing Lannes and Soult and Ney, a strong force, but a fraction of what was available. The main Prussian army, under the Duke of Brunswick, was 15 miles to the north at Auerstedt, and it was marching directly into Davout's single corps of 27,000 men. At Jena, Napoleon had the numbers and used them with mechanical precision. The Prussian commander, Prince Friedrich Ludwig of Hohenlohe, deployed his men in parade ground formations and fed them into the fighting piecemeal. Each unit arriving and engaging before the next was in position. The French infantry worked around both flanks simultaneously. By midday, the Prussian line had broken. By evening, it had become a rout, panicked men streaming north on every road, pursued by Murat's cavalry, who rode them down for miles. At Auerstedt, the arithmetic was reversed. Brunswick's army of 60,000 ran into Davout's 27,000 on a road in the morning fog. What happened next still sits in the records of French military achievement as something close to inexplicable. Davout held. He positioned his 3 divisions in a fighting retreat that somehow never retreated, bending under pressure from 3 directions, absorbing cavalry charges, and then, when Brunswick was critically wounded by artillery fire and the Prussian command dissolved into paralysis, counterattacking. By afternoon, the larger Prussian army was also in flight. The 2 broken Prussian forces collided with each other on the roads north of the battlefield. Soldiers who had not yet understood they were beaten met soldiers who had already stopped fighting, and the despair spread like water through sand. Yet the pursuit was merciless. Murat drove his cavalry forward day and night, covering 30 and 40 miles a day, arriving at fortress gates before the garrisons knew their field army was gone. Commanders surrendered fortresses that had supplies for months, that had walls and cannon and thousands of men, because the psychological shock had shattered any will to resist. Stettin fell to a few hundred French hussars, who arrived and demanded its surrender before the garrison could organize its thoughts. Kustrin, Spandau, Magdeburg, each capitulated in days or hours. Napoleon entered Berlin on October 27th, 13 days after Jena. He rode through the Brandenburg Gate and took up residence in the palace of Frederick the Great. and took up residence in the palace of Frederick the Great. He walked through Frederick's rooms and stood at his tomb. He said nothing that was recorded. The speed of Prussia's collapse stunned Europe in a way that even Austerlitz had not. Austria had been beaten, humiliated, stripped of territory, but it had not dissolved. Prussia had dissolved. One of the great military powers of the continent, the state that Frederick had built into a first-rank force through 40 years of war and reform, had been effectively destroyed in 33 days. The fortress commanders who surrendered without a fight were court-martialed after the war. Most were convicted, but their panic had not been irrational. It had been the rational response of men who understood that the institution they served had simply stopped working. A small number of Prussian officers understood something more precise than that, and among them was Gerhard von Scharnhorst, a Hanoverian-born staff officer who had watched the campaign with the cold attention of a man taking notes for future use. Scharnhorst did not believe Prussia had been beaten because its soldiers lacked courage. He believed it had been beaten because its system was wrong in its assumptions about command, wrong in its treatment of the common soldier, wrong in its relationship between the army and the society that fed it. He was right about all three. August von Gneisenau was another. He had commanded the fortress of Kolberg, one of the few Prussian garrisons to hold out, not because his position was stronger than the others, but because he refused to accept the logic of surrender that had propagated through the officer corps like a contagion. He organized the civilian population and distributed weapons to men who had never drilled and held Kolberg until the war ended. He drew the correct conclusion that an army connected to its people fought differently from one that merely occupied the same territory. The young Karl von Clausewitz was 26 in 1806 and was taken prisoner at Prenzlau. He spent the next year under French supervision, thinking. What he observed in the French system, the energy, the flexibility, the way initiative radiated downward through the ranks rather than being hoarded at the top, became the foundation of everything he would later write. He did not yet have the language for it. He was acquiring the experience. The lesson Prussia needed to learn from Jena Auerstedt was not that its soldiers were inferior. They had fought with courage in many of the engagements and been beaten anyway. But the lesson was structural. An army that moves slowly, commands rigidly, and fights as an instrument of the crown rather than an expression of the nation it defends cannot compete against one that does the opposite. Prussia's king and court did not want to hear this. What they wanted was to restore what had been lost, to rebuild the old army and try again. Scharnhorst and his allies spent the next 7 years explaining why that was impossible and quietly building something else entirely. After Berlin came the pursuit east. The Prussian state had collapsed, but Prussia's Russian ally had not, and Kutuzov's army, reinforced now by fresh forces under Bennigsen, was somewhere in the Polish winter, falling back and refusing a decisive engagement. Napoleon followed. The Grande Armée crossed the Vistula in November 1806 and moved into a landscape that was nothing like the trim German roads and provisioned towns it had crossed in October. Poland in winter was mud, cold, and emptiness. The army began to feel the distance from France. The supply situation deteriorated almost immediately. Poland had no depot network, no magazines prepositioned by a friendly power, no surplus from which 200,000 men could conveniently feed themselves. Foraging parties came back with little. The cavalry horses thinned, the infantry marched on reduced rations, sleeping in the open or in peasant huts with earthen floors, the temperature dropping steadily through December. Soldiers who had crossed the Rhine in fine condition 4 months earlier were ragged and lean by Christmas. The machine was running on less than it needed. Bennigsen understood the terrain in ways Napoleon could not easily counter. The Russian general had no intention of offering battle on ground of Napoleon's choosing. He moved laterally, retreating when pressed, striking at isolated French corps when opportunity arose. In late January 1807, He caught Ney's corps badly exposed near the town of Yonkowo and drove it back with serious losses. Napoleon turned the whole army north in an attempt to cut Bennigsen off before he could retreat behind the river Eylau. Bennigsen slipped away, barely, and fell back toward the town of Eylau. The French caught up on February 7th. A fierce engagement in the streets of Eylau itself that evening cost both sides heavily before the Russians withdrew to the heights north of the town. Napoleon had between 65 and 70,000 men. Bennigsen had perhaps 67,000, with more Prussian troops expected the following morning. The numbers were nearly even, which was itself unusual. Napoleon had fought most of his great battles with local superiority at the decisive point. Here, the armies were almost matched. February 8, 1807. Snow fell before dawn and did not stop. By mid-morning, the battlefield was a white obscurity, visibility down to a few hundred yards in places. Napoleon opened with his artillery, massing guns on the heights around Eylau in the manner that had broken enemy lines before. The Russian guns answered. The exchange was enormous. Hundreds of cannon firing simultaneously across a front of less than 3 miles. The sound described by those present as continuous, indistinguishable thunder. The assault that followed went wrong from the beginning. Augereau's corps advanced through the storm directly into the Russian battery positions. The snow thickened at the worst moment. Augereau's men, blinded and disoriented, veered off course and marched into the concentrated fire of 60 Russian guns at close range. The corps was torn apart in minutes. Augereau himself was wounded. Of the 14,000 men who had stepped off, nearly half were casualties before they reached the Russian line. The survivors broke and streamed back toward Eylau. For a period that those present described as the most dangerous of Napoleon's career, the center of the French position was open. Russian infantry advanced down from the heights into the gap, pressing toward Eylau itself, toward the church where Napoleon had positioned his command post. His personal guard formed around him. He did not move. The nearest Russian infantry were close enough that individual faces were visible through the smoke and snow. Murat saved the center. Napoleon turned to him and said, in the flat tone he used when the situation had become extreme, that those men would have to be ridden over. Murat took 80 squadrons, 10,000 horsemen, and drove them in a single mass directly at the advancing Russian infantry. It was the largest cavalry charge of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russians formed squares, and the cavalry broke around them like water. But the shock stopped the advance. The center held. The crisis passed. Ney arrived from the north in the late afternoon and struck the Russian left flank. Davout had been pressing the Russian right all day. By evening, the Russian line was bent but unbroken. Bennigsen began withdrawing during the night, pulling his army back in good order, taking his wounded, leaving his dead. He had held. He had not collapsed. He had not been destroyed or captured or forced into a catastrophic retreat. He had fought Napoleon to a standstill and then left the field on his own terms. The French held the ground. Napoleon declared a victory. By the technical conventions of 18th century warfare, it was won. The enemy had retreated. The field was French. But the field itself gave the lie to that accounting. 25,000 French casualties in a single day. Augereau's corps effectively destroyed. Thousands of frozen dead lying in the snow across several miles of Polish farmland, on the ground too hard to dig. Marshal Ney rode across the battlefield the following morning, looked at what he saw, and said what everyone was thinking. "What a massacre," he said, and without result. Napoleon toured the field himself. He had done this after every major engagement. It was part of his method, seeing the human cost directly, maintaining the clear-eyed relationship with violence that command required. Eyewitness accounts describe him at Eylau as quieter than usual. He dictated the customary bulletin claiming a great victory. The bulletin described Russian losses as catastrophic and French losses as moderate. Both claims were false. His correspondence in the days that followed was more honest. He wrote to Josephine that the sight was not pleasant, that one wished one could be less sensitive to it. What Eylau revealed was not new. The conditions that had produced it, the attenuated supply lines, the punishing winter, the enemy who refused to cooperate by standing still and accepting destruction, had been accumulating since the army crossed the Vistula. But Eylau made them undeniable. The system that had devoured Austria and Prussia in days had spent 2 weeks chasing Bennigsen across frozen Poland and had then suffered 25,000 casualties for a draw. The costs were not sustainable at that rate. The margin for error was narrowing. Friedland, in June, restored the surface narrative. Bennigsen finally allowed himself to be caught in an unfavorable position with a river behind him and his army strung out on a single crossing point. And Napoleon administered the kind of punishment the campaign had been seeking since November. Russia sued for an armistice. The Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807 brought Napoleon to perhaps the peak of his continental power. France, dominant from the Atlantic to the Niemen. The Prussian state reduced to a rump, Russia temporarily aligned. But the crack that had opened at Eylau did not close. It waited. The Prussia that emerged from Tilsit in the summer of 1807 was barely a state. Napoleon had left it alive, partly as a buffer, partly as a deliberate humiliation, a demonstration that he could afford to be magnanimous with what remained of a power he had broken. The kingdom was stripped to 4 provinces. Its army was capped by treaty at 42,000 men. It was required to pay an indemnity it could not afford and to host French garrisons it could not feed. Frederick William III, the king, had retreated to Memel on the Baltic coast with what remained of his court as far from the French as Prussian soil allowed. This was the moment Scharnhorst had been preparing for without knowing it. The catastrophe of Jena had discredited the old military establishment completely. The generals who had surrendered fortresses without a fight, the staff officers whose plans had crumbled on contact with French speed, the aristocratic commanders whose purchase of rank had not come with any corresponding purchase of competence. For the first time, the court was willing to listen to men who had been saying uncomfortable things. A military reorganization commission was established in July 1807, with Scharnhorst at its head. The first thing Scharnhorst abolished was flogging. This is not a small detail. Flogging was the enforcement mechanism of the entire old system. The reason common soldiers did not desert, did not question orders, did not exercise anything resembling individual initiative. An army that controlled its men through the threat of physical punishment was an army whose men contributed nothing beyond the minimum required to avoid the lash. Scharnhorst understood that you could not build the kind of force Napoleon had, one that foraged, that made decisions at the corporal level, that fought with something resembling personal investment out of men who were effectively enslaved. In place of corporal punishment, Scharnhorst introduced a code that treated the common soldier as a citizen. Your promotion from the ranks became possible, in principle, and then increasingly in practice. A soldier who demonstrated courage or skill had a path forward that did not depend on the accident of his birth. This was revolutionary in a society as stratified as Prussia's, and the Junker aristocracy resisted it bitterly. Scharnhorst pushed through what he could and waited for the resistance to exhaust itself against the evidence of what the new system produced. The officer corps was the harder problem. Prussia's officers were not, as a class, stupid or cowardly. Many had fought well at Jena and Austerlitz, but they had been trained to execute, not to think. The Frederican system had concentrated decision-making at the top and demanded obedience below. A Prussian battalion commander in 1806 waited for orders. A French one seized opportunities. Scharnhorst needed to produce officers who could do the latter, and that required a completely different kind of education. The Allgemeine Kriegsschule, the General War School, was established in Berlin in 1810. It was, in effect, the world's first modern staff college. Officers were selected by examination, not by connection. They studied mathematics, history, geography, and what Scharnhorst called Kriegswissenschaft, the science of war, which meant the systematic analysis of past campaigns to derive transferable principles rather than rote imitation of Frederick's tactics. The school was small at first. Its influence would prove enormous. Clausewitz joined the faculty. He brought with him the intellectual framework he had been building since his captivity after Jena, a conception of war not as a set of rules to be mastered, but as a domain of friction, chance, and uncertainty in which the quality of judgment mattered more than the perfection of any plan. He was not yet writing the book that would eventually crystallize these ideas. He was teaching them, refining them in conversation with officers who had experienced the same shattering education he had. The school was, among other things, a collective attempt to think through what had happened at Jena and why. Gneisenau worked on a parallel problem: the relationship between the army and the nation. The French conscript armies fought differently from professional ones, partly because they were fighting for something they could name: liberty. And the Republic, France, Napoleon. The ideology shifted over time, but the connection between soldier and cause remained. Prussia's soldiers fought for the king. Gneisenau believed they needed to fight for Prussia, which was a different and larger thing, and that creating that connection required giving common men a genuine stake in the society the army defended. The Krimper system was the mechanism by which Scharnhorst solved the treaty problem. Napoleon had capped the Prussian army at 42,000 men. The cap applied to the standing force. It said nothing about trained reserves. Under the Krimper system, soldiers were cycled through active service in short rotations, trained, released back into civilian life, replaced by the next cohort. By 1813, Prussia had a standing army of 42,000 men, exactly as the treaty required. It also had a trained reserve of roughly 150,000 more, waiting. The reforms extended into logistics and organization. Prussia adopted the corps system, the Central French innovation, as its own operational structure. Each corps would have its own artillery, cavalry, and infantry, capable of independent movement and fighting. Staff officers trained at the Kriegsschule would serve in these corps, applying the new doctrine in the field. The army Prussia was assembling in secret was not simply a larger version of the old one. It was a different kind of army, built on different assumptions about what soldiers were and what officers were for. None of this happened smoothly. The Junker aristocracy fought the meritocratic officer reforms at every turn. The king vacillated, committed to modernization in moments of clarity, yet retreating from it under conservative pressure. Scharnhorst died of wounds in 1813 before he could see the full result of what he had built. Gneisenau and Clausewitz carried the work forward, but there were years when the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain, when the reformers were a small and embattled faction in a court, still nostalgic for a past that had already failed it. What kept them going, in part, was the example they were working from. Napoleon had published the blueprint at Ulm and Austerlitz. The Prussian reformers read it with the methodical attention of men who had been humiliated by it and who had no intention of being humiliated again. They were not copying France blindly. They were extracting the principles: speed, initiative, the educated officer, the connected soldier, and translating them into a Prussian context, now with Prussian materials against a future French threat. They were, in a precise sense, doing to Napoleon's system what his system had done to every army before it. By 1812, the army taking shape in Prussia's 4 truncated provinces was not yet ready. It would need one more year of quiet preparation and one enormous external shock to bring it fully into the war. That shock was coming. It was already moving east, 200,000 horses deep, toward the Russian steppe. When it came back, or what remained of it came back, the world it returned to would look at Prussia's rebuilt army and find, for the first time, something that could face the French in the open field and not break. Scharnhorst did not live to see Leipzig, but the army that fought there was his. Every Prussian soldier who held his position under fire at Ligny, every staff officer who moved a corps through the night to arrive at the right place at the right moment, every junior commander who made a decision without waiting for orders, they were all, in some sense, the product of the years of reform that had begun in the wreckage of Jena. The Prussian army of 1813 was the most complete answer yet assembled to the question Napoleon had posed in 1805. What does it take to build a machine like his? This. In the spring of 1808, Napoleon made a decision that had no military justification. The Spanish Bourbons were unreliable allies. That much was true. Their navy had been destroyed at Trafalgar. Their army was antiquated. Their government was riven by a feud between the king, Charles IV, and his son Ferdinand that had paralyzed policy for years. Napoleon invited both men to Bayonne, and on the French side of the Pyrenees, stripped them of their claims in a series of meetings that were less negotiations than dictations, and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. He expected gratitude from a nation he was liberating from incompetent rulers. He received something else entirely. The Spanish Rising of May 1808 began not as a military campaign, but as a popular explosion. In Madrid on the 2nd of May, crowds attacked French soldiers in the streets with whatever came to hand: knives, cobblestones, their bare hands. Murat's cavalry rode them down. The executions the following morning, carried out against anyone found with a weapon, were intended to demonstrate the cost of resistance. They had the opposite effect. News of the rising spread across Spain within days. And every province that had been watching cautiously now made its decision. By June, the whole country was in revolt. The geography of Spain made the revolt impossible to simply crush. It was not Prussia, a flat country crossable in all directions by a fast-moving army. It was a high, dry plateau, ringed by mountain ranges, with a road network that existed on maps more reliably than on the ground, cut through by river valleys that became killing grounds for any column moving without cavalry screens. The distances between major cities were enormous. An army that held Madrid controlled Madrid, and not much else. The country absorbed French forces the way sand absorbs water. They spread out and disappeared. The guerrilla emerged from this geography almost organically. Spanish regular armies were defeated repeatedly and quickly. They could not match French corps in the open field. But the men who survived those defeats did not go home. They went to the hills. They came back in groups of 10 and 20 and 50, attacking supply convoys, cutting couriers, shooting sentries, and vanishing before a response could be organized. The word guerrilla, little war, entered the military vocabulary of Europe because Spain required a new word for what was happening. A French courier leaving Madrid for Burgos required an escort of 300 men to have a reasonable chance of arriving. A supply column moving flour to a garrison in the south needed cavalry outriders and infantry flankers, and still ran the risk of finding the road ahead blocked and the road behind it suddenly occupied. And every soldier deployed to protect a road or a depot or a courier line was a soldier not available for the field army. By 1810, France had 250,000 men in Spain and controlled less of the country than the numbers suggested. The French response was predictable and counterproductive. Reprisals against villages suspected of sheltering guerrillas produced more guerrillas. Collective punishments burned towns that had previously been neutral and turned their populations into active enemies. The logic of counterinsurgency that the French applied, destroy the environment the guerrilla swims in, required a level of systematic violence against civilians that exhausted and brutalized the French soldiers who carried it out, alienated every Spaniard who had been willing to accept the new order, and generated the exact conditions it was trying to suppress. Francisco Goya was watching. He recorded what he saw in a series of etchings called The Disasters of War. They are among the most honest documents of the period. Into this environment in August 1808 came a British army under Sir Arthur Wellesley. He was 39, relatively unknown, a general whose reputation had been built in India against enemies Europe considered marginal. He landed in Portugal with 15,000 men and an understanding of the strategic situation that was, from the beginning, cleaner than anyone else's. He was not there to conquer Spain. He was there to make Spain unconquerable. Wellesley understood Napoleon's system at a level most of his contemporaries had not reached. He knew that the French corps needed to live off the land, which meant they needed to move, which meant they could not hold ground effectively while also advancing. He knew that a battle fought on the right terrain could neutralize French tactical advantages, that the firepower of a line of infantry lying behind a ridge crest, invisible to the enemy until the last moment, could stop an attacking column that had no target until it was already within range. He had thought carefully about what the French system required in order to function and had identified several things it could not function without. The reverse slope defense was not an invention. Concealing troops behind high ground was as old as warfare. But Wellesley used it with a consistency and deliberateness that made it a system in its own right. At Talavera, at Salamanca, at Vitoria, his infantry was positioned where French artillery could not effectively engage it, where French cavalry could not charge without first cresting a ridge, where French skirmishers probing forward found nothing until the moment the British line rose and fired at 40 yards. The attacking column, designed to generate shock and momentum, had its shock absorbed and its momentum stopped before it closed. Wellesley, Wellington by 1809, after the victory at Talavera, understood supply in a way French commanders in Spain never did. He built a logistics system in Portugal that the French could not disrupt, drawing supplies from Britain by sea into Lisbon, establishing a base of operations that did not depend on foraging. His army ate. The horses were fed. The men's boots were replaced when they wore out. This was not glamorous. It was the foundation on which everything else rested, and it meant that his army remained an effective fighting force through years of campaigning that ground French forces down to exhausted and half-fed shells of themselves. The lines of Torres Vedras were the physical expression of this strategy. Wellington had them built in secret, 30 miles of interlocking redoubts, ditches, and artillery positions blocking every approach to Lisbon across the rough terrain north of the city. When Massena's army of 80,000 men arrived before them in October 1810, expecting to find an improvised defensive position, it found instead a fortified system that could not be taken by assault and could not be bypassed. Massena sat before the lines for 6 months, eating his horses and watching his army starve on the stripped Portuguese countryside. He retreated in March 1811, having lost a quarter of his force without a major battle. The Peninsular War cost France around 250,000 casualties over 6 years. The number is approximate because the record-keeping deteriorated as the war went on and the quality of replacement troops declined. What is not approximate is the strategic drain. Spain consumed an army that could have been at Wagram, at Dresden, at Leipzig. It tied down marshals, Soult, Massena, Marmont, Jourdan, who were needed elsewhere. It created a front that could not be won, but could not be abandoned. A commitment that fed on itself, requiring ever more men to produce ever less result. Napoleon visited Spain once, in late 1808, took personal command, won several sharp engagements that briefly suggested the rebellion might be suppressible after all, and then left to deal with Austria. He never came back. He never fully understood what he had started. He continued to believe that the right marshal with the right instructions could resolve the peninsula, and he continued to cycle marshals through it, often giving them conflicting orders, withholding resources, demanding victories without providing means. The war ground on. The machine bled. What Spain demonstrated was the outer limit of what Napoleon's system could do. It was a system built for decisive engagement, for finding the enemy's main force, destroying it, and dictating terms to the government that had fielded it. Spain had no single main force to destroy, no government stable enough to accept terms, no army whose defeat would end the war. Yet Wellington and the guerrillas together had created a conflict that Napoleon's genius could not resolve, because it had been specifically, if not always consciously, designed to deny him the conditions his genius required. The ink on the Treaty of Pressburg was barely dry before Archduke Charles began dismantling the army that had signed it. He had commanded in Italy during the 1805 campaign, not in Germany, and had not been present at Austerlitz, but he understood precisely what Austerlitz meant. It meant that the Austrian military system as it existed could not compete with Napoleon's, not in speed, not in coordination, not in the quality of its officer decisions. He wrote to his brother the Emperor in February 1806 and said, with the directness of a man who had earned the right to be blunt, that what was needed was not repairs, but reconstruction. Francis gave him the authority to do it. In June 1806, Charles was appointed commander-in-chief of the Austrian army and head of the Council of War. The two positions together giving him the kind of consolidated control that reformers in Prussia would spend years fighting for. He moved immediately. New drill regulations went out in 1806. The most obviously incompetent generals were dismissed. The Hofkriegsrat, the Court War Council, a bureaucratic labyrinth that had been making Austrian military decision-making slow and opaque for generations, was restructured to reduce the layers between command and action. The corps system came next. Charles had watched Napoleon use it at Ulm and Austerlitz and understood its logic completely. He introduced brigades and corps into the Austrian order of battle, giving subordinate commanders formations of all arms capable of independent operation. He concentrated the artillery, pulling battalion guns from their traditional positions distributed along the infantry line and massing them into reserves that could be directed at the decisive point. He was copying Napoleon's methods with the methodical attention of a man who had been beaten by them and intended not to be beaten by them again. The Landwehr was the most ambitious element of the reform. Charles and his brother Archduke John together developed a territorial militia, the Landwehr, that could field up to 230,000 men in wartime without drawing on the regular establishment. The concept borrowed directly from the French nation in arms principle that had generated the revolutionary armies in the 1790s. Every Austrian male of military age was, in principle, available. The Landwehr was not a frontline force. Charles was realistic about what militia could and could not do. But it was a reserve of trained men that dwarfed anything Austria had previously been able to call on. He also abolished corporal punishment in the Austrian army. This was, like Scharnhorst's identical reform in Prussia, a signal about what kind of force Charles was trying to build. An army held together by the lash fought differently from one that had some other reason to stand its ground. So Charles could not offer his soldiers the ideological connection that the French revolutionary armies had. Austria was not fighting for liberty or the nation, but he could treat them as men rather than as property, and he believed this would change how they behaved under fire. The reforms were not complete by 1809. Charles said so himself. 3 years was not enough to transform an institution of that size and inertia, and the conservative elements of the Habsburg court had slowed and diluted several of his proposals. But when Austria went to war again in April 1809, invading Bavaria before Napoleon could concentrate, hoping to catch the Grande Armée wrong-footed while it was still digesting its commitments in Spain, the army that crossed the border was measurably different from the one that had capitulated at Ulm. It moved faster. Its corps operated with more independence. Its artillery was better handled. Its infantry, when it stood and fought, stood longer. Napoleon recovered from the initial surprise with characteristic speed, winning a series of sharp actions at Abensberg, Landshut, and Eckmühl in late April that drove the Austrian forces apart and allowed him to occupy Vienna on May 12th. But Charles salvaged his army intact, withdrawing it north of the Danube and placing the river between himself and Napoleon. With Vienna taken and no decisive battle yet won, Napoleon needed to cross. He chose a crossing point near the island of Lobau, southeast of the city, and began constructing pontoon bridges across the fast-running spring flood of the Danube. Now, the first French units crossed on the night of May 20th and occupied the villages of Aspern-Essling on the north bank. Charles attacked the following morning with roughly 100,000 men against a French force that was still crossing. The bridges kept breaking under the pressure of the swollen river and the large timber floats the Austrians were sending downstream to destroy them. Napoleon was fighting a battle with one hand, managing a river crossing with the other, and discovering that the enemy in front of him was not the army he had beaten 4 years earlier. Aspern changed hands 6 times in the course of May 21st. The Austrian infantry, fighting in the street-by-street close-quarters way that the village terrain demanded, held positions that at Austerlitz they had abandoned under far less pressure. That the corps structure Charles had imposed meant that divisional and brigade commanders made decisions without waiting for orders that might arrive too late. Individual Austrian soldiers who had been trained under the new regulations held their ground in circumstances where their predecessors in 1805 would have broken. The second day, May 22nd, brought crisis. The main bridge collapsed again, stranding 60,000 French troops on the north bank with no prospect of reinforcement. Napoleon pressed forward anyway, driving toward the Austrian center with everything he had. For a few hours, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Then, in the early afternoon, a cannonball struck Marshal Lannes as he sat on a bank observing the fighting, inflicting a devastating blow. He sustained mortal injuries on the field and died 9 days later. And on May 31st, the first of Napoleon's inner circle of marshals to fall. Napoleon wept. He had known Lannes since the Italian campaigns of 1796. Without reinforcement and with Lannes down, the French position became untenable. Massena managed the retreat back across the bridges with the skill of a general who had spent 30 years learning how to move troops in the dark under pressure. The French pulled back to the Lobau. They had lost somewhere between 20 and 23,000 men in 2 days. Austrian casualties were comparable, but the Austrians had held the field. In his official bulletin, Napoleon acknowledged 4,100 casualties and described the battle as a tribute to French firmness. No one who had been there believed him. The psychological impact of Aspern-Essling spread across Europe faster than any dispatch. Napoleon had been beaten, not by bad luck, not by treacherous weather, not by the failure of a subordinate, but in a straight fight by an army he had humiliated 4 years earlier on ground of his own choosing. Austrian confidence surged. The troops who had fought at Aspern knew something now that they had not known at Austerlitz. That French infantry could be stopped, that French columns could be held, that the man across the river was not invincible. Wagram, 6 weeks later, restored the surface of French dominance. Napoleon spent the interval on the Lobau, rebuilding his bridges, bringing up reinforcements, bringing his artillery park to a strength that dwarfed anything he had previously assembled. He crossed on the night of July 4th with 170,000 men and forced a 2-day battle that cost both sides over 30,000 casualties. Charles fought well. His left flank nearly broke the French line on the second morning. But the weight of French artillery, firing over 70,000 rounds in 2 days, eventually ground the Austrian army back. Charles asked for an armistice 4 days after the battle and resigned his command on July 23rd. Never to lead an army again. The strategic logic that drove Napoleon into Russia in the summer of 1812 was not irrational. Tsar Alexander had pulled Russia out of the continental system, Napoleon's trade embargo against Britain, in December 1810, effectively reopening the continent to British goods and puncturing the economic pressure Napoleon had been applying for years. Yes, without Russian compliance, the system collapsed. Without the system, Britain could trade freely and fund coalitions indefinitely. Napoleon calculated that one sharp campaign would bring Alexander back to the negotiating table. He had done it before, at Tilsit. He would do it again. What he built for the campaign was the largest army in European history. By the time the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, it numbered somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000 men. The sources disagree on the precise figure, reflecting genuine uncertainty about how many of the Allied contingents were under effective French command. Slightly less than half were French. The remainder came from the German states, Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, and virtually every other territory under Napoleon's control. An army of that size had never been assembled in the modern era. Napoleon understood in the abstract the dangers the campaign posed. He had ordered the construction of a massive supply system, nearly 8,000 wagons, supply depots positioned along the Vistula Valley, magazines pre-stocked with food and ammunition. He intended the war to be decided quickly before the Russian winter arrived. The supply system was designed to support the army for 40 days, which was all the time he expected to need. The assumption embedded in the plan was that Russia would behave like Prussia, that it would offer battle, lose, and negotiate. Russia did not behave like Prussia. The Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly and then Bagration, fell back almost immediately. There was no Ulm, no Austerlitz, and no single engagement where Napoleon could apply the full weight of his system and end the campaign in an afternoon. The Russians retreated east, burning what they left behind: crops, villages, fodder, the timber bridges across every river. Cossack cavalry screened the withdrawal and harassed French supply columns. The scorched earth was not a formal policy so much as an instinct, a population that understood what it meant for the French to find food and ensured they found none. The Grande Armée began dying before it fought a major battle. The heat of the summer made the march brutal. Horses died by the thousands in the first weeks, drinking from contaminated wells, collapsing under loads they could not carry. Disease moved through the columns with a speed that matched the army's advance. Typhus, dysentery, and a dozen other fevers that had no name in the medical vocabulary of the time cut down men who had survived a dozen campaigns without a scratch. By the time the army reached Smolensk in August, it had lost perhaps 100,000 men to sickness, straggling, and exhaustion, and had not yet fought its decisive battle. Napoleon took Smolensk after a fierce engagement on August 16th and 17th, expecting the Russians to stand and fight for their second city. They burned it and retreated. He stood in the ruins and faced the choice that the campaign kept presenting him with: stop here and establish winter quarters, or continue east toward Moscow. His generals, those who dared speak, counseled stopping. Napoleon continued. Moscow was the psychological center of Russia, the ancient capital, and the city whose fall would surely compel Alexander to negotiate. He pressed the army forward. Kutuzov replaced Barclay de Tolly in late August, under pressure from the Tsar and the Russian public to stop retreating. He found a position at Borodino, roughly 70 miles west of Moscow, built earthwork redoubts across the road, and waited. Napoleon arrived on September 5th. 2 days later, on September 7th, the two armies fought for 15 hours across a front of several miles, the uninterrupted cannon fire audible as a continuous roll that survivors described as unlike anything they had heard before or after. More than 250,000 men were engaged. At least 70,000 of them became casualties before nightfall. Borodino was a French victory by the only measure Napoleon recognized. He held the field at the end of the day, and Kutuzov retreated during the night. But the victory consumed 30,000 French soldiers the army could not replace at that depth inside Russia. 8 of Napoleon's generals were killed. Napoleon himself was ill, feverish, struggling to concentrate, and made the decision that his own officers judged the critical error of the battle. He refused to commit the Imperial Guard to the final assault. The Guard was the army's irreplaceable core. He would not risk it. The Russian army escaped intact. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th. He rode into a city that was almost empty. The population had been evacuated on Kutuzov's orders. Within 48 hours, 3/4 of the city was on fire. The Russians had set it deliberately, burning their own capital rather than leave it as a comfortable winter quarters for the French. Napoleon looked out from the Kremlin at the smoke rising across the city and waited for the delegation from Alexander that would signal the beginning of peace negotiations. No delegation came. He waited 5 weeks. He sent letters to Alexander. He made peace proposals through intermediaries. Alexander did not respond. The Tsar had decided something in the months before the campaign that Napoleon had not allowed for, that Russia would not negotiate from a position of defeat, that losing Moscow was acceptable if it meant keeping the army intact, that time and space were weapons against which French tactical genius had no answer. Napoleon finally ordered the retreat on October 19th, weeks later than any military logic permitted. The retreat destroyed what Borodino had left. The army that left Moscow was already a shadow, perhaps 100,000 effective soldiers with thousands of stragglers and camp followers strung out behind it. It took the same road it had come by, a road the army had already stripped bare on the way east. There was nothing to forage. The cold came early and stayed, temperatures dropping to levels that the medical officers had no treatment for. Men fell asleep and did not wake up. Horses died in the traces. The artillery was abandoned when the horses could no longer pull it. Then the baggage, then the wounded. The Berezina River crossing on November 26th through 29th defined the disaster in miniature. 3 Russian armies converged on the crossing point, each intending to destroy what remained of the Grande Armée on the river's eastern bank. French engineers under General Bled built 2 pontoon bridges in conditions that killed most of them, working in the freezing water as ice floes struck the supports, maintaining the crossings for 3 days against the current and the Russian fire. Most of the engineers did not survive the retreat. The bridges held long enough for the fighting force to cross. Tens of thousands of stragglers, slow and sick and unable to push through the crowd, were left on the eastern bank when the bridges were burned. Berezina entered the French language as a word for catastrophe. Of the roughly 600,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 112,000 returned to the frontier. Most of the rest were dead, killed in battle. So killed by disease, killed by cold, killed by the Cossacks who rode down stragglers along every mile of the retreat. The survivors were not an army. They were individual men who had kept walking when those around them stopped. Napoleon had handed command to Murat on December 5th and left for Paris ahead of the wreckage to manage the political consequences before the scale of the disaster became fully known. What Russia demonstrated was not that Napoleon had been outgeneraled, though Kutuzov's strategic patience was remarkable. It demonstrated that the system built at Ulm and Austerlitz, a system designed to find the enemy's main force, destroy it decisively, and end the war in a single campaign, had no answer for a country large enough to absorb the blow, a government resolute enough to refuse negotiation, and an army wise enough to refuse the battle that Napoleon's system required. Russia had not defeated the French army. It had simply declined to be the kind of war Napoleon knew how to fight. The men who came back from Russia arrived in dribs and drabs through the winter of 1812 and into the spring of 1813. Severely frostbitten, hollow-faced, many of them bearing terrible winter injuries, most of them without weapons, few of them capable of serious military service for months. The army that had crossed the Niemen in June with somewhere between 450,000 and 600,000 men returned fewer than 112,000 to the frontier. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered across 1,000 miles of Russian steppe and Polish mud. What came home was not an army. It was evidence. Napoleon moved with his customary speed. He was in Paris by December, managing the political consequences of the disaster before they could manage him. He drafted new conscription decrees within weeks of his return. In January 1813, he called up 100,000 men who had reached military age in previous years and had not yet served, and another 150,000 who would have reached it in 1814. He was spending the future, pulling forward men who should not have been needed for another year, because the present had been consumed. France had been conscripting continuously since 1798. By 1812, the levy system had already reached into cohorts that in any previous era would have been left at home. The men who built the Grande Armée that invaded Russia were not the veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. Those men were largely dead or scattered across a decade of campaigns. They were younger, less experienced, formed faster, and deployed with less preparation. The army that entered Russia was already a diluted version of its predecessor. What Napoleon was now trying to build in the winter of 1813 was a diluted version of that. The Marie-Louise were the clearest expression of how far the system had been stretched. The term came from the decree of October 9, 1813, signed by the Empress Marie-Louise in Napoleon's name, which called up 200,000 more men. To find them, the recruiting age had to be dropped. Regulations were changed to allow the enlistment of the youngest possible cohorts, and the minimum height requirement was reduced to 5 feet and 1 inch. These were not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were mere youths rushed into service with a few weeks of training and pointed toward a war that was already lost. Draft evasion had been a chronic problem since the conscription laws were first introduced in 1798, and it grew worse with every passing year of war. The réfractaires, men who disappeared before joining their units, accounted for the largest portion of the absent. In the mountain regions and the remoter rural departments, whole communities sheltered their sons from the gendarmerie. By 1813, 8 out of every 10 Frenchmen of military age had already been drafted. The men who remained were the ones who had managed to stay invisible, and the system was increasingly struggling to find even them. The Allied contingents that had marched with Napoleon were dissolving under a different kind of pressure. The Confederation of the Rhine, the belt of German client states Napoleon had organized after Austerlitz, had provided troops for every campaign since 1806. They had fought at Wagram, suffered at Borodino, and been destroyed alongside the French in Russia. The soldiers had been reliable enough when France was dominant. As the war turned, the political calculus of their rulers shifted. Bavaria defected to the Sixth Coalition by treaty on October 8, 1813. At Leipzig, 10 days later, the Saxon and Württemberg contingents defected in the middle of the battle itself. The quality problem was not just about numbers. An army's effectiveness depends on what its veterans pass down. The accumulated knowledge of how to march, how to forage, how to hold a defensive position under artillery fire, how to maintain formation when the man next to you falls. That knowledge lives in the soldiers who have done it before, and it transfers to new men through proximity and example. By 1813, the pool of veterans had been nearly exhausted. The new conscripts were being formed in units where there was nobody left to teach them what the older men had learned at Ulm and Austerlitz. They were brave, many of them. They were not experienced. The corps commanders were under the same pressure. The marshals who had led Napoleon's corps through the great years, Davout, Soult, Masséna, Lannes, had been products of the Revolutionary Wars, tempered by 15 years of hard campaigning before 1805. By 1813, Lannes was dead. Bessieres was dead. And as several others were commanding in Spain or consumed by other theaters. The men available to lead corps in Germany were capable officers, but they were working with depleted staffs and untrained soldiers, without the years of operational experience that had made the corps system function at its peak. The supply system collapsed along with the manpower. The empire's finances had been strained by continuous war since 1803, and the Russian campaign consumed resources that could not be quickly replaced. The new army forming in the spring of 1813 was chronically short of horses. The cavalry arm in particular was gutted because horses die faster than men in the conditions of the Russian retreat and cannot be conscripted by decree. Napoleon's ability to gather intelligence, to screen his movements, to pursue a broken enemy, all functions that depended on cavalry, was severely compromised at precisely the moment the coalition was growing stronger. Typhus rode back from Russia with the survivors and spread through the German garrisons and the depots where new conscripts were being assembled. The disease moved faster than the recruiting system could replace the losses it caused. Men who arrived at their units already sick were in no condition to train, and the medical resources of the empire, already strained by a decade of war, could not contain an epidemic moving through crowded barracks. Some units had lost a third of their effective strength to illness before they reached the field. Napoleon understood what he was working with. His correspondence from this period is striking in its clarity about the deficiencies of the new army. The lack of cavalry, the rawness of the infantry, the shortage of experienced officers. He complained about marshals who moved too slowly, subordinates who failed to execute, allied contingents whose reliability he could not count on. He asked for things he could not have: veterans who no longer existed, horses that could not be bred fast enough, officers who could only be formed by years of experience he could not compress. He knew the machine was broken. He kept running it anyway. The November 1813 levy, 300,000 more men called after Leipzig, went largely unfilled. The conscription machine that had delivered millions of soldiers over 15 years had finally hit its limit. There were not 300,000 men to be found who could be marched to a depot, trained, equipped, and deployed before the coalition crossed the Rhine. France was a country that had been at war almost continuously since 1792. Its villages had been sending their young men away for a generation. The ones who remained were too young, too old, or too determined not to go. The spring of 1813 opened with something that should not have been possible. Napoleon, commanding an army of raw conscripts who had been drilling for weeks rather than years, defeated the combined Russian and Prussian forces at Lutzen on May 2nd, and then defeated them again at Bautzen 18 days later. He was working with troops who had never fought a major battle in a theater where his cavalry was too depleted to pursue, and he was still winning. The coalition armies retreated. The men who had designed them looked at each other and understood that the question of whether Napoleon could be beaten in the field remained unanswered. The armistice that followed Bautzen, agreed June 4th, gave both sides time to consolidate. Napoleon accepted it because he could not pursue without cavalry, and because the victories at Lutzen and Bautzen had not been decisive. The Allied armies had escaped intact both times. The Allies accepted it because they needed Austria, and Austria needed time to make up its mind. When the armistice expired in mid-August, Austria had joined the coalition, and the balance of numbers had shifted dramatically. The Allied commanders now had something they had not had before: enough men to lose Napoleon and still win. And the plan they devised was formulated on July 12th at Trachenberg Palace in Silesia, in a conference that brought together the Allied commanders, Schwarzenberg for Austria, Blücher for Prussia, Bernadotte for Sweden, and the North German contingents, with Russian forces distributed across all three. The principal architect was Bernadotte, a former French marshal who understood Napoleon's operational methods from the inside, with contributions from the Austrian Chief of Staff Radetzky. What they produced was the most sophisticated strategic document the coalition had yet assembled, and its central insight was devastatingly simple. Do not fight Napoleon. Whenever Napoleon himself leads an army toward an Allied force, that force retreats. It does not engage. It falls back, trading space for time, keeping itself intact, and forcing Napoleon to follow and extend his already overstretched supply lines. The fight, when it comes on terms that are not Napoleon's. in attrition, in exhaustion, in the grinding mathematics of a coalition that can replace its losses and a France that cannot. The corollary was equally precise: attack the marshals. Napoleon's corps commanders were capable officers, but they were not Napoleon. And in 1813, they were working with the same inexperienced conscripts and depleted cavalry that made his own victories incomplete. Every time an Allied army found itself facing Ney or Oudinot or MacDonald rather than Napoleon himself, it was to engage and destroy. The coalition divided itself into three armies specifically to make this possible: the Army of Bohemia under Schwarzenberg with approximately 225,000 men, the Army of Silesia under Blücher with 95,000, and the Army of North Germany under Bernadotte with 120,000. Three separate commands, each capable of independent action, each with a clear set of rules about when to fight and when to refuse. The plan worked with almost mechanical regularity. When Napoleon turned south in August to deal with the Army of Bohemia at Dresden, he won, August 26th and 27th, a sharp victory that cost the Allies 38,000 casualties against 10,000 French. It was his last major battlefield success. But while he was at Dresden, Oudinot advanced on Berlin and was stopped at Grossbeeren by the Prussians and Swedes on August 23rd. MacDonald attempted to engage Blücher along the Kotzebach River on August 26th, the same day as Dresden, and was routed, losing 15,000 men. Vandamme, pursuing the defeated Allied army after Dresden, was cut off and destroyed at Kulm on August 29th, losing 30,000 men captured or killed. Ney replaced Oudinot for a second attempt on Berlin and was beaten at Dennewitz on September 6th. The arithmetic was unmistakable, and Napoleon saw it clearly. He was winning every battle he fought personally and losing every engagement where a marshal faced an improved Allied army. Dresden had cost the coalition 38,000 men and gained him nothing strategically, because the three Allied armies simply absorbed the blow, yet regrouped and continued applying pressure from their separate directions. He could not be everywhere. His marshals could not match him. The plan had identified the seam in his system and was pressing on it relentlessly. There was a deeper logic operating beneath the tactical arithmetic, and it was one that Napoleon would have recognized as his own. The Trachenberg plan was built on the same principles as the corps system: multiple independent forces converging on the decisive point, each capable of operating autonomously until the moment of concentration. The coalition had taken the organizational lesson of Ulm and Austerlitz and applied it to an entire theater of war. They were not imitating Napoleon superficially. They had understood his system well enough to build a version of it large enough to contain him. By October, yet the three Allied armies had maneuvered Napoleon into a position he had spent his career forcing onto others. He was at Leipzig with approximately 190,000 men. The Army of Bohemia was to the south. The Army of Silesia was to the north. The Army of North Germany was closing from the northeast. A fourth force under Bennigsen, the Army of Poland, was approaching from the east. The total coalition strength converging on Leipzig exceeded 320,000 soldiers. Napoleon had no line of retreat except west, through the city itself, and over a single bridge across the Elster River. The battle began on October 16th and lasted 4 days, the largest engagement of the Napoleonic Wars, 500,000 soldiers fighting across a front that stretched around the city's entire perimeter. Napoleon held his position through the 16th and 17th, his veterans and his conscripts fighting with genuine ferocity against attackers who outnumbered them nearly 2-1. On the 18th, the Saxon contingent in the French line, 4,000 men, defected in the middle of the battle, turning their guns on their former allies. It did not decide the outcome, but it expressed it. Napoleon began the retreat through Leipzig on the 19th of October at 2 a.m, pulling his army westward through the city's narrow streets toward the single bridge over the Elster. The retreat was organized and was proceeding in tolerable order when a French corporal, frightened by the Allied troops pressing into the city's eastern suburbs, lit the bridge's fuse prematurely. The explosion came while the bridge was still crowded with retreating soldiers, and tens of thousands of men were still on the eastern bank. 30,000 French troops were trapped in Leipzig and taken prisoner the following day. Many thousands more died attempting to swim the Elster. The 1813 campaign had cost France 400,000 men. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved in the days that followed Leipzig. Bavaria had already defected by treaty on October 8th. Württemberg followed during the battle. The remaining German client states peeled away in rapid succession as the Allied armies advanced west. The empire Napoleon had built east of the Rhine. A decade of carefully constructed alliances, installed relatives, and forced loyalty evaporated in a matter of weeks. By early November, the Allies had formally dissolved the Confederation. Napoleon crossed back into France with perhaps 70,000 effective soldiers. Behind him, 100,000 men garrisoned in isolated fortresses across Germany, and Poland would eventually surrender without relief. What the Trachenberg campaign demonstrated was not merely that Napoleon could be beaten. That had been demonstrated at Aspern-Essling and suspected after Eylau and implied by everything that had happened in Spain. What it demonstrated was that the coalition had learned to think at the strategic level the way Napoleon thought at the operational level. That it could coordinate multiple armies across a theater of war with the same purposeful concentration that he applied to a single battlefield. The student had not just absorbed the lesson. The student had scaled it. He landed in southern France on March 1st, 1815, with 1,000 men, no artillery, and no money. The Bourbon monarchy Louis XVIII had restored was unpopular, a regime that had returned in the baggage train of the Allied armies, that had given back the old aristocracy's lands, that treated the veterans of 20 years of war as an inconvenience. The soldiers sent to arrest Napoleon joined him instead. By March 20th, he was in Paris. Louis XVIII had fled north 3 days earlier without firing a shot. It was the most remarkable return in European political history, and it lasted 110 days. The powers assembled at Vienna responded immediately. Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, and most of the secondary states of Europe declared Napoleon an outlaw on March 13th and pledged to dethrone him again. The coalition armies were already partially mobilized. The Congress of Vienna had been managing European security for months, and the planning began at once for converging advances into France. Wellington and Blücher were the closest, cantoned in Belgium with combined forces that together outnumbered Napoleon's army nearly 2-1. The Austrians and Russians were further away, but coming. Napoleon's strategic logic was the same logic he had applied for 20 years. Attack before the coalition could concentrate, destroy one army before the next arrived, force a peace before the full weight of Europe could be assembled against him. The difference was that the armies he faced in 1815 were not the armies of 1805. They had spent 10 years absorbing his methods, reforming their staffs, training their officers, were in building the institutional knowledge that turned an army from a mass of men into an instrument of precision. They were not the same opponents. Neither, in certain ways, was he. He crossed into Belgium on June 15th with 72,000 men, moving with much of his old speed. The campaign opened well. He drove between Wellington and Blücher, preventing them from concentrating, and on June 16th, he fought both simultaneously. At Ligny, he attacked Blücher's Prussian army personally and won, inflicting around 17,000 casualties and forcing the Prussians to retreat. At Quatre Bras, Ney engaged Wellington and failed to destroy him. Both Allied armies survived and fell back in the same direction, north, meaning they could still link up if circumstances allowed. Napoleon sent Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the Prussians and keep them from rejoining Wellington. Grouchy followed cautiously, too cautiously, his critics would say. marching away from the sound of the guns at Waterloo when the battle was already beginning. The Prussians, under Blücher, beaten but not broken at Ligny, marched toward Wellington's position with a determination that defined everything about what the Prussian army had become since Jena. Blücher was 72 years old. He had been unhorsed at Ligny, ridden over by cavalry, and temporarily knocked unconscious. He was back in the saddle and moving toward Waterloo before dawn on the 18th. Wellington chose his ground with the same deliberateness he had brought to every position he had ever defended. The ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, on south of the village of Waterloo, gave him the thing he had always sought, a reverse slope. He placed the bulk of his infantry behind the crest, invisible from the French positions below, protected from artillery fire, appearing to Napoleon's observers as a thin and potentially fragile line. 3 strong points anchored the position: the chateau of Hougoumont on the right, the farm of La Haye-Sainte at the center, and the hamlet of Papelotte on the left. Wellington intended to hold all 3. Napoleon delayed his attack until nearly midday, waiting for the sodden ground to dry enough for his artillery to maneuver. The delay gave the Prussians another 3 hours to close the distance. And when the French Grand Battery opened, a concentration of guns that would have been recognizable to any veteran of Borodino, it fired largely at the ridge crest and at empty air. The British and Allied infantry lying in the grass on the reverse slope beneath it, mostly out of sight and mostly out of danger. Wellington's positioning was doing precisely what he designed it to do. The battle that followed was not subtle. D'Erlon's corps attacked the Allied center and left in the early afternoon and was repulsed with heavy losses, the British heavy cavalry countercharging with devastating effect before riding too far and being cut down in turn. French cavalry, 9,000 horses in 67 squadrons, charged the Allied infantry repeatedly through the afternoon. Now, the horses breaking against British squares that stood in the same positions for hours, the men inside rotating the wounded out and the fit in, maintaining formation under conditions that, at Austerlitz, would have been impossible to ask of most European infantry. The squares held. The crisis came around 6 in the evening, when French infantry finally captured La Haye-Sainte. The farmhouse had been Wellington's center anchor, and without it, the French could bring artillery forward to within close range of his line. His center began to thin. A French battery unlimbered within 300 yards of his main position and fired into the packed infantry. Wellington rode along the line himself, in the open, moving from regiment to regiment. He said later that the battle was the nearest thing he had ever seen. He was not speaking loosely. Blücher's Prussians began arriving on Napoleon's right flank in the late afternoon, not in a single mass, in corps, arriving progressively, forcing Napoleon to detach increasing numbers of troops to hold the village of Plancenoit and secure his flank. By 7 in the evening, Napoleon faced a choice he had not faced since Eylau: commit the Imperial Guard or accept that the battle could not be won. He committed them. 6 battalions of the Old Guard, the finest infantry in Europe, men who had never retreated in a pitched battle, marched up the slope of Mont Saint-Jean toward the Allied line. Wellington had placed the British First Foot Guards behind the crest, invisible, lying in the grass. As the French column breasted the ridge, he called out to their commander, "Now, Maitland, now's your time." The Guards stood up, 40 yards from the leading French column, and fired. The Imperial Guard staggered. It did not break immediately. It was the Guard, but it had never encountered disciplined volley fire from troops it could not see until the moment of contact. Other Allied regiments fired into the flanks of the column. The cry went up from somewhere in the French lines that had not been heard on a Napoleonic battlefield in 15 years. La Garde, recule. The Guard is retreating. The psychological effect was instantaneous and total. The Guard had been the fixed star of the French army's faith in itself, the guarantee that Napoleon held a reserve that could not fail, that the worst moment of any battle was not truly the worst because the Guard had not yet moved. When it moved and was stopped, something broke that was not a formation. And the French line disintegrated from right to left, the retreat becoming a rout within minutes, men throwing down weapons and equipment, the roads south filling with soldiers who had stopped being an army. The Prussians pursued through the night, giving no rest to a force that had none left to give. Wellington and Blücher met at a village called La Belle Alliance, the Beautiful Alliance, on the road south of the battlefield as darkness fell. French casualties were approximately 40,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Allied casualties were around 22,000. Napoleon abdicated 4 days later on June 22nd and was sent to St. Helena in the South Atlantic, 7,000 miles from France, where he would spend the remaining 6 years of his life. He never commanded an army again. The diplomats who gathered in Vienna in the autumn of 1814 faced a problem that no previous peace conference had faced at quite this scale: how to reorganize a continent that had been remade by 23 years of nearly continuous war. The old map was gone. The Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 years old, had been dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. Dozens of German principalities had been swept away, merged, annexed, or reconstituted as client states. Spain had been occupied, bled, and liberated. Italy had been reorganized multiple times. The boundaries that existed in 1814 bore almost no resemblance to those of 1792. The final act of the Congress of Vienna was signed on June 9, 1815, 9 days before Waterloo, while Napoleon was already moving north into Belgium. The statesmen at Vienna had not waited for the last battle. They had built their settlement on the assumption that however the 100 days ended, the era of French hegemony was over. The agreement reorganized Europe around 5 great powers: Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, and France itself, restored to its pre-revolutionary borders, with a web of buffer states and territorial compensations designed to prevent any single power from achieving the dominance Napoleon had wielded. The concert of Europe that grew from Vienna was something new, an attempt to manage great power relations through regular consultation rather than perpetual war. It was imperfect, and it would fray under the pressures of nationalism and revolution in the decades that followed. But it held against major general conflict for nearly 40 years. Europe did not fight another war involving all its great powers until 1854. And even that one, the Crimean, was limited in scope in ways that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had lived through Borodino or Leipzig. The military ideas that the Napoleonic Wars had generated were harder to contain than borders. Every major European army emerged from the conflict with a transformed understanding of how war was organized and conducted. The core system, Napoleon's central innovation, was adopted universally. The general staff, in the form that Prussia had developed it, became the model for every army that wanted to be taken seriously. Meritocratic promotion, examination-based officer education, the systematic analysis of past campaigns. These practices spread from the Prussian Kriegsschule outward across the continent over the following decades. Mass conscription was perhaps the most consequential inheritance of the era. Napoleon had demonstrated that a nation which mobilized its entire male population for war could field armies of a scale that dynastic powers using professional soldiers could not match. His enemies had demonstrated that the only answer to a conscript army was another conscript army. By 1815, the connection between military service and citizenship, the idea that a man who fought for his country had a stake in it worth fighting for, was embedded in the institutional memory of every European state that had participated in the wars. The draft did not disappear with Napoleon. It became a permanent feature of European statecraft. The nationalist energies that the wars had unleashed were more difficult to manage than the military ones. Napoleon had spread the ideas of the French Revolution across Europe in the baggage train of his armies. Legal equality, the abolition of serfdom, the notion that political legitimacy derived from the people rather than from dynastic inheritance. He had also, by occupying and humiliating the old nations of Europe, generated a counterforce. The idea that peoples defined by language, culture, and shared history had a right to their own political existence. Germany had not existed as a unified state before Napoleon. By the time he was finished, the idea of it did. The German Confederation that Vienna created, 38 states loosely associated under Austrian leadership, was the attempt to contain that energy within a structure the great powers could manage. It failed eventually, and in the way that all such attempts fail, when the idea they are trying to suppress is more powerful than the institution suppressing it. The wars of German unification that Bismarck fought in the 1860s and 1870s were fought by armies whose doctrine, whose staff organization, whose very conception of what a modern military force was, descended directly from the reforms that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had built in the wreckage of Jena. The Prussian army that destroyed Austria in 1866 and France in 1870 was, in a precise institutional sense, the grandchild of Austerlitz. Clausewitz published nothing in his lifetime that carried the weight of what he had been thinking since his captivity after Jena. He died of cholera in November 1831, leaving the manuscript of Vom Kriege, On War, unfinished and in disorder. His wife Marie edited and published it the following year, 1832. It was dense, often difficult, written in the philosophical idiom of early 19th century German thought. It was also the most penetrating analysis of armed conflict that any participant in the Napoleonic Wars had produced. Not a manual of tactics, but an attempt to understand war as a phenomenon, to describe the friction and uncertainty and the interplay of political will and military force that determined outcomes. Clausewitz's central insight was the one that the wars themselves had demonstrated most clearly, that war was not a science with fixed rules, but a collision of opposing wills, shaped by chance and uncertainty and the psychological state of commanders and men. Napoleon had understood this instinctively. His enemies had been forced to understand it by being beaten. The Prussian reformers had embedded the understanding in their institutional structure, in the officer education that trained men to think rather than to execute, in the staff doctrine that anticipated the fog of battle rather than assuming it away. On War was the articulation of what they had all learned, turned into a text that would shape military thought for the next 2 centuries. The wars had cost Europe somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million military deaths, with civilian casualties adding millions more. France alone had lost something approaching 1 million men in uniform over the course of the conflict. The demographic mark was visible for a generation. The cohorts missing from French villages, the women who did not marry, the children who were not born. Russia's losses at Borodino and in the subsequent campaigns were comparable. Prussia's dead lay in the fields of Jena and Auerstadt, and across the German campaign of 1813. No previous war in European history had consumed human life at this scale. And yet, what the wars had produced in the cold accounting of institutional history was a Europe that knew things it had not known before. It knew that a nation which mobilized its entire population for war was a different kind of force from one that deployed professional soldiers. It knew that an officer corps selected on merit rather than birth fought differently from one selected on connection. It knew that a staff system capable of planning and executing complex operations was as decisive as any battlefield genius. It knew, above all, that military knowledge could be analyzed, taught, then transferred, that the genius Napoleon had seemed to possess was not magical, but methodological, and that method could be learned. Napoleon died on St. Helena on May 5, 1821, 6 years after Waterloo. He spent much of his time on the island dictating his memoirs, shaping, with considerable skill, the story that would be told about him. He presented himself as the child of the revolution betrayed by the dynasts, the man of peace who had been forced into war by the hostility of Britain and the old powers. It was a compelling narrative, not entirely false, and it ensured that his reputation would survive his defeat in ways that few defeated leaders' reputations do. The legend of Napoleon, the comet, the genius, the man who almost remade the world, began on St. Helena. It has not ended yet.